Welcome back to biology. And this particular section is about the cell membrane, in particular the structure of the cell membrane. And we had learned earlier this unit about cell parts, and the cell membrane we said was important because the cell membrane has the job of controlling what enters and leaves the cell. Here in this animation, we've got a cell membrane here that's somehow controlling what comes in and what goes out, that certain things like maybe nutrients are allowed in and maybe something else like salt is not allowed in, though that depends on the situation too. But basically this concept of the cell membrane is able to control what goes in and what goes out. And that's probably something that you learned even before this year. You probably learned that back in 7th grade if you're part of the Oregon School District, maybe even back in 5th grade, that the cell membrane has this important job. But we never really talked about how that works. How is the cell membrane able to know what is allowed in and what doesn't get to come in at all? Again, in this diagram, we have our cell membrane here, but how does that do this? Or better yet, how does this do that, according to the screen? We've got the cell membrane here, and it looks like these orange cubes are able to pass through the cell membrane. How does the cell membrane know that those are allowed to pass through and maybe some other things aren't? In order to understand that, we have to take a more specific look at what the cell membrane is made out of. So the cell membrane is made out of two basic parts. One called a phospholipid bilayer. Big scientific word, but we'll make sense of that in just a moment. This is a picture of what that phospholipid bilayer is going to look like. And then in addition to that bilayer, there is are proteins that are found in the phospholipid bilayer. Here in this picture, we've added in a little more detail. There's the phospholipid bilayer, the blue circles and the red tails, but here are the proteins that are present too. And those proteins play a key role in allowing the cell membrane to know what comes in and what doesn't. So let's look at these two components in a little more detail here. Phospholipids. When we say phospholipids, it's a fancy way of saying fats, though there are a whole bunch of different types of fats. This just happens to be one of them. And the cell membranes are made out of these fats called phospholipids. In your notes, it's worth diagramming what this phospholipid looks like, that it has a circular part on top, at least the way we sketch it, and then two tails that are coming off. How you draw the number of these back and forth zigzags doesn't really make a difference. You can even draw them as straight if you want. In the end, there are these two tails. And the tail part, the overall thing there is a phospholipid, but the tail part is hydrophobic. And if you think about what that word means, hydrophobic, break it down. Hydro means water, and of course phobia would be a fear. This portion here is the lipid part, and that part absolutely hates water. And the part that's up top is the phosphate part. That's hydrophilic. Hydrophilic, water loving. Like Philadelphia is supposedly the city of brotherly love. Delphia means city, and philos means love, a brotherly type of love. And hydrophilic, that portion of the phospholipid loves to be in contact with water. Now, phospholipid, this is just one of them, but to make a cell membrane, we have two layers of these phospholipids that are arranged so that they are pointing away from each other in two layers. So here we have, in this diagram, we have water up top and water down below. This might be the outside of the cell and maybe the inside of the cell. But notice that these two layers of fats, one layer up here, one layer down below, are pointed in such a way so that the hydrophilic, the water-loving phosphate, is up top, and the water-fearing or hydrophobic lipid tails are in the center, pointing away from the water. That's just the way chemistry works. Things that like to be in contact with each other are going to find a way to be arranged so that they're in contact with each other. And so when we have these two layers, we have the phospholipids pointing away from each other in these two layers. Since your cell membrane is made out of two layers, of fats called phospholipids. We just say that they are a phospholipid bilayer, bi meaning two. So if you really want to impress the folks, around the dinner table, if they ask, what did you learn in biology today? Tell them you learned about the phospholipid bilayer. I think they'll kind of leave you alone after giving them such a big term. There it is, phospholipid bilayer. And of course, make sure you sketch that in the notes. If you need to pause the video, please do. In addition to phospholipids, we find these proteins. The cell membrane has proteins, and what these proteins do is it uses them to bring things into and out of the cell. The cell membrane, those phospholipids, really just act as a barrier, but it's the proteins that really do all the heavy lifting of determining what goes in and what doesn't, and then actually bringing those objects into the cell. These proteins come in two different types. One of those are called channels. In this diagram, we have the phospholipid bilayer here, and then this purple thing is a channel. It's a tunnel of sorts that's going to allow objects to move through them. And we also have proteins called receptors. And we'll learn in a moment that these receptors, like this Y-shaped protein here sitting in the cell membrane, are able to grab onto things from outside the cell and then pull them in. So two different types of proteins, channels and receptors. More specifically, protein channels, these cell membrane channels, bring molecules into a cell by opening a tunnel for molecules with the right shape and size to pass. Cell membrane here, lipid bilayer, this is the protein, the protein channel. And in this case, it looks like the red spheres here, whatever they might be, it might be some sort of nutrient, are able to bind to this channel, and then the channel brings that on in. To show you what that looks like in animation form, we have that set up for us right here. And if we play the animation, we'll see that we have these proteins sitting here. And if we speed that up, we'll be able to bring in some of these larger molecules across that membrane. As you're watching this, by the way, a link to this animation is available at the website. Those red things could be sugars, they could be other nutrients that the cell needs, but there that nutrient goes, passing from outside the cell to inside the cell. Anyway, you can watch that at the website if you'd like. In addition to receptors, the cell membrane, well, that should say something different. In addition to channels, the cell membrane also has receptors. I think that'll be different in your notes there. Receptors here is probably listed as channels. And anyway, those receptors are then used to pull things into and out of the cell. So this is a little bit different than opening up a channel. Instead, what we have in this diagram here would be the cell membrane in blue, and then these are receptors here in purple. And as we'll see in the animation, these protein receptors are able to grab hold of those red circles and bring them in versus just opening up a tunnel. So let's take a look at that animation here. Here we've got a cell that is needing to bring in this green item there. If we speed that up, it's able to do that. But in order to know that that's something that it needs to bring in, let's take a look at how those proteins work, those protein receptors. And so these receptors are able to specifically bind to those objects, and then notice they don't open up a channel. Instead, what they do is they work to allow the cell membrane to wrap itself around those receptors and then pull them in. So here we go, speeding that up a little bit, wrapping themselves around and then pulling them in. Same end result. The red circles here are now inside the cell, so this is the inside the cell, and the blue is the outside the cell. But just different process. One using channels, one using receptors. And a link to this animation is available at the website also. In both cases, those cell membrane proteins are what we're going to refer to as specific. And what that means is that different receptors have different shapes and different channels have different shapes to allow them to be able to do their job. If they don't have the right shape, they're not going to be able to work. And so receptors or channels that need to bring in sugar have one shape, and receptors or channels that need to bring in iron have a different shape, and receptors or channels that need to bring in something like maybe, proteins that you're eating have a different shape. There are a whole bunch of different shapes to these, and you'll have to get these sketches from somebody else in the class if you're watching this online. But we sketched out what that looks like. Different shapes for different receptors and channels. In the end, the cell uses receptors and channels for a variety of different purposes. Here's an example of a receptor again and having very specific binding to this yellow hexagon. But some examples of different cell membrane receptors would include something like an insulin receptor. We're going to learn at the end of this unit how insulin receptors are able to control sugar levels. We also have receptors to help us connect to adrenaline. Adrenaline is a hormone that's produced by adrenal glands on top of your kidneys, and that adrenaline causes the body to tense up and run or fight or whatever it's going to do under stress. In order for the body to know, for a cell to know that adrenaline is present, if this yellow was adrenaline, then it would have to be able to bind to an adrenoreceptor inside the cell membrane. Then the cell would bring that adrenaline in and respond. Another example would be olfactory receptors that are found in your nose for a sense of smell, very similar to the taste receptors that are found on your tongue to help you taste things that might be bitter or sweet. That in the tongue you have the cell membrane and certain receptors like the ones that allow you to taste bitter things found in foods. If this is a bitter chemical, it would have to bind to the bitter taste receptor, and then your body would pull, or your cell would pull that inside and respond accordingly. A whole bunch of different examples that we're going to come across. In the end, I'm less concerned that you're able to give examples of cell membrane receptors than I am that you're able to explain that the cell membrane is made out of two layers of phospholipids, that those phospholipids are pointing away from each other. One side of it's hydrophobic and another side is hydrophilic, and that it's these proteins that come in the form of channels and receptors that are able to control, in the end, what goes into and out of cells. This particular presentation is only about the structure of the cell membrane. You're going to find another presentation about how the cell membrane works to be able to bring those items in. So we're going to give you a little more detail in a different presentation about how channels and receptors work. If you have questions, don't hesitate to let me know. Otherwise, we'll see you in class.